Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the channel where I, a real-life lawyer, examine the laws of history. Today's topic, an overview of the origins of Bronze Age law. 1. The mythical origins of law. Allow me to set the stage. The first complex civilizations sprung up around 4000 BC. That's 1500 years before the pyramids were built, 2700 years before Moses and the Exodus, 2900 years before the Trojan War, and 4000 years before Rome became an empire. In other words, 6000 years before today. The place? Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the cradle of civilization. The people? Sumerians, the descendants of those who survived the Great Flood and flourished in this land. They founded a city called Eridu, which they claimed to be the first city in history. The chief god of the city of Eridu was called Enki, the benevolent god who was said to have given humanity knowledge, thereby angering the sky gods. In the Greek tradition, his name is Prometheus. In the Jewish tradition, his name is Lucifer. The mechanisms of the imparting of knowledge diverge, though. Prometheus stole the secret fire of Zeus and gave it to man. The Jewish tradition took a more metaphorical approach, with Lucifer, whose name literally means light-bringer, convincing Adam and Eve to eat the forbidden fruit against God's orders. The story of Enki is much more fun. It is a story about drunken incest and seduction. Enki, again, god and protector of the city Eridu, had a daughter, Inanna, later known as Ishtar or Aphrodite. She was the goddess of the city of Uruk. One day, Inanna came to visit her father, not simply because she was passing through town and wanted to say hello, but because she, in the prime of her life and at the epitome of her beauty, intended to steal the secrets of civilization from him by way of seduction. The story begins with Inanna donning a crown and admiring the appearance of her own genitals, something that many people today do before they go to work. Several references are made to her glorious vulva in the opening lines. She then heads to Eridu to see her father and steal the secrets. Her father, Enki, prepares a feast in anticipation of her arrival, but then unfortunately the tablets containing the story are broken for several lines. When it picks up, Enki and Inanna are in the throes of a beer drinking competition, the nature of which we do not know. We also do not know if she successfully seduced him. What we do know is that by the time the tablets pick up again, Enki is as drunk as a Sumerian skunk because we see him slurring his words and swaying with every additional drink. Please allow me to make the following dramatic reading. To my daughter Inanna, I shall give the high priesthood, the noble and enduring crown, and kingship. Inanna graciously accepted, and they drank. Enki raised his glass again, this time proclaiming, I give you truth, the keys to the underworld, the keys to escape the underworld, the art of love making, and the kissing of the fellow. Inanna again accepted, and they drank. This went on another 12 times. By the end of it all, Enki was hearing colors and seeing sounds. Having thus conveyed unto Inanna all knowledge, the art of love, work, money, travel, deceit, truth, pleasure, misery, building, fire, music, war, and most important for our purposes, judgment and laws, he went to bed. He woke up the next day, wondering where the hell all of his things were. Inanna had escaped with them, gone back to Uruk, and conveyed those gifts onto her people. That is the myth. Now let us talk about the history. 2. The laws of Nammu. The first law code we have is from the city of Ur in 2100 BC. This is by no means the literal first set of laws created because we have references to earlier law codes, including the law code of Urkagina and Sargon of Akkad. Both of them had laws, it's just that none of them survive. We have some letters from Sargon's time about 200 years earlier referencing legal actions, including an individual named Ginsu who failed to take an oath, a contract gone wrong, and a contract for 1 liter of good quality beer cake. There are also letters pertaining to the conveyance of land pursuant to the laws, including property that was wrongfully seized while a man was away at war. As an aside while I'm speaking, I am going to butcher a lot of these names, so please stay with me. Sargon's empire collapsed, and it was replaced, albeit after a 40-year period of chaos, by the third dynasty of Ur. The man responsible for the conquest was Nammu, king of Ur for 18 years. Once he got done conquering everything, he settled down and created his code of 57 laws. Now, 57 is not a big number. In fact, it's very, very, very small. Most towns and villages today have more laws than that currently on the books. What I'm saying is that the code was not comprehensive and was not intended to deal with every possible infraction. Instead, they were a loosely cobbled set of precedent and rules that could be applied to other situations as needed. Let us begin with the structure of the laws. They are all written in if-then form, meaning if you do blank, then you will be punished with blank. Nearly every law code after that takes the same conditional form. As for substance, the death penalty was predictably a thing, but not as extreme as people may think. Murder, robbery, and rape would result in punishments of death. Raping a slave was a property offense and therefore resulted in a fine. That is the extent of the death penalty. That is also the extent of the violence. The laws called for payment of certain sums of money, called a schedule, to compensate an injured person. The law code doesn't care so much about how the injury was done, just that it was done, and that the person injured would be paid. Eyes were worth a lot, feet were worth less. The only law that really cares about how you injured the person is one that says if you sever someone's nose with a copper knife, you would pay a fine. The code is silent as to what would happen if you used a bronze knife or if you smashed the nose in with a rock. The specificity of the code raises the question, why? Were copper knives the weapon of choice for criminals, or was the use of copper somehow more culturally egregious? We will never know. Although there were no additional punishments involving death or violence, there is a punishment that involves pure luck and deserves further mention: the Mesopotamian Water Ordeal for one accused of sorcery. This is known in other cultures as the Divine River Ordeal. It went something like this. You have been accused of witchcraft. The only way to prove or disprove culpability for such conduct is to leave it to the gods. You would be thrown in the river. If you survived, the gods surely took pity on you as you were innocent. If you drowned, you were surely guilty as the gods punished you. The river ordeal was also applied to women accused of cheating by someone outside of the marriage. This may sound similar to the Salem witch trials, but they got it backwards. In Salem, if you drowned, you were innocent. If you lived, you were guilty and would be killed anyway. Very much a lose-lose proposition. Nammu also imposed fines for false accusations. So say you falsely accuse somebody of murder, or the person you accused of witchcraft survived the river ordeal, you would owe the wrongfully accused the sum of money set forth by the code. Likewise, perjury was punished with a fine. There were also laws compelling slave owners to scour their slaves' mouths with salt if they spoke out of turn, and the final 3 laws pertain to stealing someone's farmland, flooding farmland, and penalties for renting but then doing nothing with farmland. Happily, we have hundreds of letters from the 3rd dynasty of Ur putting these laws into action. They add a new dimension, and I find them very interesting. For example, although not written down, it appears that those in debt could be jailed by way of custom. One of my favorite letters is as follows. Speak to Iridan and Ili Rabi. Why, oh why, have you not repaid Inanna the mina of silver? I am being jailed because of this matter. Write to me so that I may know what is going on. We could also glean how criminal matters were handled once the accusation was levied. Pre-trial detention was a thing, and it does not seem like they had bail. A letter states that Atu, Lu Urub, and Lugal Magur are robbers and are being held in the town of Bargisa, most likely having been caught there. They were ordered in the letter to be transferred to the city, in other words, extradited, where they had committed the crime to answer for their actions. The remainder of the letters are purchase orders and settlements, most of which end with the emphatic statement, "This matter shall not come up again." And that is it for Nammu. His empire lasted another 200 years. 3. The Laws of Lipit Ishtar. The next law code we have is from Lipit Ishtar from the 1st dynasty of Isin. Where did Isin come from? Good question. The 3rd dynasty of Ur collapsed after Ur was sacked by a gaggle of filthy, stinking Elamites. The Elamites went home, but the power of vacuum allowed another people, the Amorites, to settle in the area. In the Bible, the Amorites are the descendants of Canaan, who gave his name to the land. That is where we get the name Canaanites. Canaanites are not an ethnic group. It's a generic term for the people who lived in what is now the Mediterranean coast of the Middle East. The Amorites, on the other hand, were an ethnic group. They were a group of people that appear to have been indigenous to the land. They got their butts kicked by Sargon of Akkad and took a while to recover, and the collapse of the Third Dynasty of Ur is exactly what they were waiting for. Their stock ruled various kingdoms and city-states in the area from around 2000 to 1600 BC. Lipit Ishtar was the fifth of the Amorite kings of Isin and devised his own law code. His notable additions apply to property rights and child support. Regarding property, there were now fines for stealing, cutting down other people's trees, and laws pertaining to land values in a way almost akin to a Bronze Age homeowners association. Under those laws, let's say you owned a parcel of land in the faraway city of Lagash. The only reason you have it is because you inherited it from your now deceased uncle. The lot is overgrown with wheat and undesirable plants. Your neighbor is upset because you neglected your land and it's making his house look ugly. In fact, people are beginning to think that the homes on the street are abandoned and looters have started ransacking the neighboring homes. Lipit Ishtar made it so that you, the owner of the crappy-looking parcel of land overgrown with wheat and undesirable plants, would be liable to pay the damages incurred by your neighbors by way of the looting. He also made a way for you to legally steal somebody else's land. Most states today have a thing called adverse possession. If you, comporting with certain requirements, care for, upkeep, and reside on a piece of property that is not yours for an extended period of time set by law, you will eventually be entitled to all or some of that property. Lipit Ishtar created the first adverse possession law that we have on record. Under his legal code, a stranger could pay the taxes on somebody else's house. The owner would then have 3 years to repay the stranger. If the stranger was not repaid within those 3 years, the stranger would take the house. We also have here the first child support law. Strangely though, it's not for divorced couples, but for harlots. That's right. If a man's wife was unable to give him children, but a harlot from the public square was able to, the man was to provide the harlot with grain, oil, and clothing. The children of the harlot would become the man's legitimate heirs. This appears to have caused some problems, however, because the law also expressly forbids the harlot from living in the house with the wife while she remains alive. I'm sorry, hold on. The last 4 laws have to do with oxen. Historically, oxen were the trucks and freightliners of today. They made the world move. They were essential in trade, construction, and farming. I find them boring. That said, the laws all pertain to money paid for injuring part of the ox, including the fleshy part of the nose around the nose ring. Unfortunately, we only have a handful of letters from around this time, none of which pertain to legal matters, aside from ordering the release of a captive slave woman. 4. The Laws of Eshnunna. A handful of years after Lipit Ishtar came the Laws of Eshnunna. Until now, all of the laws were named after the person who ordered their drafting, Nammu and Lipit Ishtar. Eshnunna was not a person. It was a city-state in northern Mesopotamia, farther away from the cities mentioned earlier. The man behind the laws was named Dadusha, who was later overthrown by a guy named Hammurabi. I will call them the Dadusha laws, mostly because I enjoy saying the word Dadusha. Dadusha's laws are somewhat scattered, and they're more casually grouped than the other 2 preceding law codes. They begin with setting forth how much any one commodity was worth. 1 shekel of silver, for example, was equivalent to a kor of barley, 1 seah and 2 kwa of sesame oil, 6 minas of wool, or 3 minas of copper. Dadusha's laws contain the first mention of negligence that we have. The reference is in his 5th law. If your hired boatman sinks your boat with your stuff on it, he would owe you the full value of the items on board. Similarly, the guard that you hire to guard your house would be liable to you if your home was burgled on his watch. Speaking of burglary, the next set of laws has to do with theft. Someone caught stealing crops during the day would pay a fine, but somebody caught at night would be put to death. The same logic applies to somebody who breaks into a house. During the day, you would be assessed a fine. If you broke in at night and were caught, you would die. This is the first instance of the death penalty being applied to theft crimes. Why? Because the theft was seen as more egregious if it took place at night. That's not so far away from what we understand burglary to be, because up until rather recently, many law codes in the United States had as a requirement of burglary that the breaking and entering be done at night. That was later amended, so now if you break into somebody's house during the day, it's burglary all the way around. The Dusha's law codes also had laws pertaining to liability for the actions of animals. This is something that has not changed for thousands of years. Today, in most places, if you're bitten by a dog and the dog was known to be aggressive by the authorities, the owner will be liable to pay for your injuries. In his 56th law, the Dusha said essentially the same thing. The owner would owe 2/3 a mina of silver. The same applied to oxen, who were known to gore people and ended up actually doing so. People were also liable for shoddy construction. If you built a wall and it was falling over and you were told to fix it but you didn't, you would be liable for the injuries caused when it inevitably fell over. Just keep in mind that they didn't have police or inspectors as we know them now. They had what was called a ward, about whose job we know very little, but there was some sort of local official who kept track of these things. Now, in the event that the dog bite victim or the wall crush victim died from his or her injuries, jurisdiction was reserved by the Dusha himself to decide the case. Why? Because the offense involves death. The death transforms the charge from a simple dog bite or a falling wall to that of murder, and the punishment for murder was death. Therefore, the king had to hear the case. Also notable about the Dusha's laws is that he made child support mandatory not just for harlots as in the prior code, but for any man who gave up his child to the care of another, requiring that the man provide clothes and food. That said, it appears based on the laws that the father traditionally got custody of the children, and all issues of custody were in his sole domain, meaning that he could pawn them off to somebody or he could choose to keep them. The Dusha's laws also address other family issues, including one issue that reminds me of the later king Odysseus of Ithaca. If a man was away from his family for an extended period of time due to war or captivity, and his wife remarried thinking he was dead, when he came back, he would be able to reinstate his marriage. In the story of Odysseus, Penelope didn't remarry, but he was gone for quite a while, and based on this logic, she could have been entitled to remarry if she wanted to. If, however, and the law says this, he left because he defected and went to another kingdom voluntarily, he would not be entitled to get his wife back. On a different matter, the 22nd through 24th laws finally codify the long-standing practice of debt slavery, a topic so comical in its Bronze Age context that I'm making a separate video about it, which will be linked here at some point in the future. The general idea is that if you owed somebody money, they could kidnap you, your family, or anybody else related to you, including your slaves, and force them to crush barley until the debt was repaid or until they died. Again, more on that later. Now we return to the history. The kingdom of Eshnunna was in the north of Mesopotamia, sandwiched between Assyria and the third dynasty of Isin. The third dynasty of Isin collapsed and was replaced by Babylon. So, around 750 BC, it was sandwiched between Assyria and Babylon. We do not have a copy of the old Assyrian kingdom law codes, but we do have several letters from around the same time as the kingdom of Eshnunna. One of the letters is a pathetic attempt at a debt collection. Although it's from Assyria, it sheds some light on the practices of the time. It reads as follows. Please tell Pozor, Ashur, Amora, and Ashur Samsi, 30 years you left the city of Ashur. You have not made a deposit since, and we have not recovered 1 shekel of silver from you. But we have never made you feel bad about this. Our tablets have been going to you with caravan after caravan, but no report of you has ever come here. We have addressed the claims to your father, but we have not sought any of your private silver. Please, come back right away. Should you be too busy with your business, deposit the silver for us. Remember, we have not made you feel bad about this matter, but now we are forced to act as gentlemen should not. If not, we will send you a notice from the police and thus put you to shame. You will cease to be one of us. 5. Hammurabi. Eventually, the city-state of Eshnunna fell, thanks in part to political intrigue, international scheming, and of course, a retreating army of sordid and smutty Elamites who sacked the city, therefore paving the way for a certain Babylonian to conquer the city from the south. Let us now turn to the great Hammurabi of Babylon, who gets credit for drafting the first law code, which you already know is a total lie, since we just went through 3 law codes that came before him. Before continuing, I would like to make something very clear for the young people out there. His name was Hammurabi, not Harambe. Harambe was a gorilla who was wrongfully killed in 2016. Many of us point to Harambe's death as marking the beginning of the decline of modern civilization. That said, we are not discussing that demise here. Hammurabi, not Harambe, had a law code. Hammurabi's code is deservedly famous for being comprehensive. It contains 282 laws, the largest law code that we have to date. Indeed, as you have seen, each lawgiver worked off a similar set of ideas and frameworks, adding and subtracting laws as necessary. Hammurabi was no exception, and, in my opinion, had an even greater task. He had a large empire consisting of villages and towns, each with their own laws and codes. Most of the laws and codes didn't make sense, especially once you factor in jurisdictional issues. For example, let's say you commit a crime in the city of Ur but then flee to Uruk. Which city's law applies? Moreover, the laws of the various cities set forth fines and the prices of commodities. Some were written hundreds of years earlier. Which fine applied from which city? How much would a commodity cost? Hammurabi had to square all of these circles. So Hammurabi took these laws and sometimes he borrowed them, sometimes he completely changed them. But the fact that he was able to boil it down to 282 laws deserves some recognition. Let us begin with Hammurabi's first law, which gives rise to an interesting insight: the death penalty for those who make false accusations. In earlier times, false testimony or accusations nearly always resulted in a fine, and at no time was the offense the first of all of the laws listed. In fact, normally it was mentioned in the end. Here is the insight. By opening his laws in this way, Hammurabi is showing his people that he is the giver of justice. In fact, the next 4 laws are also laws of justice. 2 of them punish perjury. A third imposes a fine when false testimony is made in commercial cases. And finally, the 4th punishes judges, making them pay 12 times the amount of an award if they later change their mind. That's a damn good incentive for the judge to get it right the first time. The next set of laws has to deal with property. A notable one is that stealing from temples results in death. We have a letter from the king of Babylon to officials and administrators investigating theft from a temple, which I have paraphrased here for clarity. You have answered into what had been written to you concerning an investigation about the silver and gold that was taken from the house of plenty, and concerning your investigation into what had disappeared. You said that you investigated the administrators, stewards, and priests 5 or 6 times, but they did not provide any leads. You also questioned the guards and their wives and daughters. You identified a guard who was with 2 females that night and indicated that you arrested 1 steward who opened the latch. When you read this tablet, you yourselves, the administrators, and the priests should take the guards and the stewards here to Babylon. The judges need not come. By way of that letter, the king himself reserved jurisdiction over the theft from the temple. Similarly, knowingly receiving stolen property, that is, buying things that you knew were stolen, also resulted in death. Robbery also resulted in a punishment of death. Interestingly, if the victim could not find the robber and the robber could not be caught, then the man could make a sworn statement to the gods before the temple and be paid by the government, a sort of Bronze Age insurance. The laws also addressed land ownership. We have a demand letter addressed to the mayor of a city regarding a man's property rights under these laws. May the gods Samas and Marduk keep you in good health. I am sending this tablet to warn you. Nobody must come near the house of the woman dream interpreter Umiwakrat. I have bought that house and all of its bricks. If somebody so much as touches a brick of it, I will go against all of you as provided by the pertinent ordinance of my lord. Also notable about Hammurabi's laws is that he had very little patience for those who didn't do their jobs. He hated lazy people. The Babylonians, much like Eshnunna, had wards or warrant officers, as we discussed earlier. They were the arms of the government and would levy judgments, collect taxes, etc. If the warrant officer felt lazy that day and hired somebody else in his place, the laws called for the warrant officer to be put to death and have the other man who he hired to replace him. Now, before we go on, this all begs the question, why the hell are Hammurabi's laws so harsh? One theory is that Hammurabi was a tyrant. Another is that he was actually a good person and just trying to make his kingdom a safe place. My personal theory is that much like today, people were poor, especially the common person, because I myself am broke. Back then, the vast majority of people had no way to pay the minas and shekels of silver contemplated by the earlier laws. The best deterrent was, instead, to threaten them with something they understood: physical harm. What you will see is that the punishments were practical. They were easily understood. Plus, as a practical matter, a fine imposed for crimes that the offender could not afford inevitably resulted in debt slavery, the topic of which we will return to soon. The next sections of Hammurabi's law pertain to family and trade. We will look at them later. First, let us talk about the infamous personal injury portion of the law code. You are already familiar with this section. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, and you walk away with this image in your head that everybody in ancient Babylon was walking around wearing eye patches, missing limbs, and had mice shoved up their noses by the government officials. The characterization is somewhat inaccurate. This section speaks to me because I'm a personal injury attorney, but I want to talk about it more because I think it's misunderstood. The first law in this section on personal injury establishes a theme: challenging authority. Along with wanting justice, it's clear that Hammurabi also expected authority, both in and out of the household, to be respected. Therefore, the first law says that if a son strikes his father, his hand would be cut off. The challenge to authority here, and not the literal strike, being the cause for the harsh punishment. Here is where things get hairy. The eye for an eye logic applied to when striking an equal, as doing harm to a person of equal status as you would result in an equal punishment. The second law provides this: a man striking out another man's eye would result in his own eye being removed. The same for the breaking of a bone, and the same for the knocking out of a tooth. However, the next few lines are the ones that are always neglected. Why? Because your high school history teachers were lazy, and they never bothered to read the entire code before trying to teach it to you. Destroying the eye of a peasant meant that you would pay the peasant in silver, implying that doing something to somebody who was worth less than you resulted in a lesser fine. Similarly, taking out a slave's eye or breaking his bones would result in payment of half the slave's price, seeming to derive from the fact that the slave is now half as productive. Just as with the child striking the father, the laws observe rules of social hierarchy. The final laws in the personal injury section pertain to causing miscarriages in women, which apparently was a common occurrence because there were 5 entire laws dedicated to it. These offenses all result in fines, with the exception of a noblewoman dying as a result of the miscarriage, in which case the offending man's daughter would be killed in exchange. The next set of laws pertains to professionals, including wages for wet nurses and other occupations. There were also punishments for what could be considered professional negligence, like a bad boat captain who sank a boat or a sleeping guard. Notably, though, we have the first mention here of medical malpractice. This section of the code contains 5 laws. The first 3 set forth the amount to be paid to a doctor if the doctor saves a patient's life. The next 2 talk about what happens if the patient dies. Today, if your patient dies, you get hit with a multi-million-dollar wrongful death and medical malpractice lawsuit. Back then, the doctor would have his hand removed, which is a harsh punishment because a doctor needs his hands to work. Just keep in mind that these doctors weren't just shamans doing rain dances. They were full-on surgeons, because the laws contemplate surgical treatment with instruments like bronze lancelets. Another gem that comes out of Hammurabi's code pertains to malpractice by barbers and state-sanctioned haircuts for slaves. You may have heard the common trope that there's only a handful of approved haircuts in North Korea. Apparently the same applied in Hammurabi's Babylon. Per the laws, slaves and free people had different haircuts, and there was some sort of social code because people were able to identify you on that basis alone. The law set up fines for a barber who cut a slave's hair and made the slave look like a free person. With the professional section out of the way, let us now return to my favorite topic: debt slavery. As I mentioned earlier, Hammurabi was a reformer. He wanted to have practical laws and practical punishments. The laws of old most likely placed people in a lot of debt. Under the old regime, if you took somebody's eye out, you owed them a mina of silver. But what if you didn't have a mina of silver? Well, now they could show up with their one eye and kidnap you or your family, children, your slaves, your dog, or whoever, and force them to farm barley until they died or until the debt was repaid. Hammurabi recognized that this was a problem, and it appears that it was such a problem that people were never getting their loved ones back, even after the debt was paid. Hammurabi's code caps the debt sentence at 3 years, after which they would have to be released by law, the debt having been satisfied. Now, the amount of the debt doesn't seem to matter. I get the impression that whether you owed a shekel or a mina of silver was inconsequential. Either way, your family would still be forced to toil for 3 years. But it may have been contracted privately by the parties. Meaning, well, it's only 1 shekel of silver, so I'll only take them into bondage for a month, so on and so forth. Speaking of contracts, Hammurabi ruled until about the year 1750 BC, which is notable for some of you history buffs. By that time, he had taken over the city of Ur, the same city that Nammu was from. There is a well-known incident arising from that time in that city, involving a copper merchant named Nasir, who was said to have conned his customer with subpar quality copper ingots. The story is especially popular with Bronze Age groups on the internet, including a Facebook group of which I am a member. Now, because the Nasir incident was so notable, I will be making a separate video. For now, we will satisfy ourselves with learning about the trade laws as set forth by Hammurabi. The section on trade looks like it was cut short. We're missing about 40 of the laws, numbers 65 to 100. Law 100 is a fragment with only the latter half of the law, pertaining to the payment of interest, remaining. We can infer what was there, though, based on letters from the time. The laws in the middle of this section talk about the duty of a merchant and agent, and punishments for carelessness or outright fraud committed by that merchant or agent. The last few laws in the set pertain to wine cellars. The wine cellars must have been women because all of the laws refer to she, whereas the remainder are geared towards men. These women were, for lack of a better term, tavern keepers. These tavern keepers would accept grain or money as payment for their drink. If the woman overcharged the customer in money, then she would be thrown into the river, in other words, drowned. Under his laws, these tavern keepers were also liable to turn in conspirators who met at the tavern and planned to commit crimes, which is pretty easy to picture. Just imagine a bunch of drunks getting together and talking about robbing one of those filthy Elamites who recently moved into town. If she didn't report him, she would be liable, under threat of death, to turn them in. Although it doesn't pertain to tavern keepers, we do have a letter evidencing the duty that a person had to turn in people who were accused of crimes. Although it wasn't expressly iterated in Hammurabi's laws, turning people in appears to have been a legal obligation. Take, for example, the following. I have written you repeatedly to bring here the criminals and all the robbers, but you have not brought them here, nor have you ever sent me word. The fires started by the robbers are still raging and ravaging the countryside. Since you have not brought them to me despite my several attempts, I am holding you responsible for the crimes which they have committed in this country. Tomorrow, I will dispatch this sealed letter of mine to the authorities. Inform me. Here's another interesting one. The code provides for implied warranties. In the law, a warranty of fitness is implied, meaning that whatever you're buying something for is good for its apparent and customary use. For example, you buy an ox because you need to plow a field. By selling you the ox, the salesman is implying that you're going to be able to do that. Hammurabi applied that logic to slaves. Under Hammurabi's law, if your slave developed epilepsy within a month of purchase and it was not previously disclosed, you could return that slave under penalty of law. One of my favorite laws is a criminal one. It has no context. It says that if you pointed at none for no reason, your forehead would be branded by those in the temple. Very strange. We will end our look at Hammurabi's code with a brief glimpse at the family laws. A married woman caught in the act cheating on her husband would result in both her and her lover being tied together and drowned. Notably, the law provides an exception to the false accusation rule stated earlier, which normally resulted in death. If a man falsely accused his wife of cheating, but he couldn't prove it, his wife could take an oath before the gods, remember, the punishment for perjury was death, and return home. Divorce was allowed if the woman has or not yet was able to bear children. Somewhat comically, unhappy marriages had other remedies aside from simple divorces. For example, if a wife had been noted to go out a lot, acted like a fool, Hammurabi's words, not mine, and failed to keep up with the house, her husband could prosecute her. He could divorce her and send her on her way without anything, but he could also keep her as a slave and then take in a new wife. It wasn't entirely one-sided though. I don't want to give the impression that men could run free. A woman who was belittled and cheated on by her husband and who has a clear and clean history of her own could leave her husband with her portion of the marital property without punishment. But if she insisted that she was belittled and cheated on and she herself had affairs or ruined her house, the punishment for her was drowning. If a woman killed her husband or enlisted someone to kill her husband, she would be impaled. Now let's talk about the fun topic of incest. Incest with a daughter resulted in banishment. And now we get into sitcom territory. If a man laid his head in the bosom of his son's future wife, and, very important, the son already knew her, this would result in the father being strangled and drowned. But if the son did not know the woman already, and the father laid his head in her bosom, the man would only pay a fine. Needless to say, based on these laws, the Babylonian men were doing pretty freaky things. Now, I want to talk about slaves momentarily while we're on the topic of family. Technically, they were property, and most laws pertaining to slaves have to do with reimbursing the owner for injuries done to the slave. But it is clear that the men were sleeping with their slaves in ancient Babylon. You know from watching this video that the old legal codes mandated child support for children born of harlots, but children born of slaves are not mentioned. The only time that they're mentioned in Hammurabi's code and in the 3 prior law codes is that when a free person had a child with a slave, that child would by default come a slave. Now, the reason that there's no child support provision for the children of freedmen and slaves is because slaves were property and the owners could logically do as they wished. But we have this one letter from a slave to her master, which is the saddest thing that I've ever read. It is easily the most depressing letter in the entire collection. It goes something like this. Tell my master, your slave girl, Debitum, sends the following message. What I have told you has now happened to me. For 7 months, this unborn child was in my body, but for a month now, the child has been dead, and nobody wants to take care of me. May it please my master to do something, lest I die. Come visit me and let me see the face of my master. Why did no present from you arrive to me? And if I have to die, please let me die after I have again seen the face of my master. Wasn't that horrible? It's so freaking sad. Unfortunately, we don't know anything else about this poor woman or the outcome of her situation, but the contents of her letter are a testament to what I like to call the other side of history, and it's also the title of a very good book, by the way, on Audible. In the other side of history, I mean normal people and the remedies that they had under the laws. This slave girl had none. On a lighter note, the final set of laws in Hammurabi's code pertain to disinheritance and inheritance. You'll find this amusing. Interestingly, the laws specify that there must be good cause, meaning a crime committed, to warrant the disinheritance of a child. When I first read this, I couldn't help but think to myself, why would they bother putting this down in writing unless people were running around disinheriting their annoying kids? As it turns out, that's exactly what they were doing. Apparently, Babylonian kids were intolerable. Take the following letter as an example. Tell Uzalim, your son, Adad Abam, sends the following message. May the gods keep you forever in good health. I have never before written to you for something precious I wanted, but if you want to be like a father to me, get me a fine string full of beads to be worn around the head. Seal it with your seal, and give it to the carrier of this tablet so that he could bring it to me. If you have none at hand, dig it out of the ground and send it to me. I want it very much. Do not withhold it from me. In this, I will see whether you love me as a real father does. Of course, establish its price for me. Write it down and send me the tablet. The young man who is coming to you must not see the string of beads. Seal it and give it to him. He must not see them. It should be full of beads and beautiful. If I dislike it, I will send it back. Also, please send the cloak of which I previously spoke to you. And yet another letter from a child to his mother says the following. From year to year, the clothes you make the young gentlemen here become better, but you let my clothes get worse. Indeed, you make my clothes poorer and more scanty. In our house, wool is used up like bread, but you have made me poor clothes. The son of a Dadadanum, whose father is a servant, has 2 new sets of clothes, while you fuss about even giving me 1. His mother adopted him, but his mother loved him, while you do not love me, despite the fact that you bore me. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why they had to make a law saying that you could only disinherit kids if they committed crimes, because clearly they were insufferable. We now close Hammurabi's laws. Hammurabi's empire came to an end after the Hittites under Mursili II sacked the city of Babylon, which gave rise to the Kassite Babylonian dynasty. Then, during the Bronze Age collapse, the lumpish and fubsy Elamites sacked the city and stole Hammurabi's code and took it home with them. As you know, Hammurabi had used his code to set the price of certain goods, and the Elamites removed those price settings, which makes sense because they came into possession of the law code about 600 years later, so the prices were probably outdated. But it begs the question, did they use the laws? Because why else would you bother removing them? If it was just a souvenir from their conquest, you'd think they would just put it behind glass and leave it as was. So it leads me to believe that at least for a while, they used them. Now, chronologically speaking, after Hammurabi's laws comes the Hittite laws, which are similar, but they're different enough to be dealt with in a separate video. So that's what I'm going to do. 6. The Middle Assyrian laws. We do, however, have the Middle Assyrian laws, which date from 1450 to 1250 BC. The structure of those laws is very similar to the laws that we've looked at so far. The first copy of the laws that we have is from a guy with a funny name, Tiglath-Pileser. If you like raunchy stuff, you're gonna like the Assyrians. They were much less concerned with property rights, debts, commerce, and criminals, and for some reason only wrote down the laws pertaining to sex, magic, and dysfunctional marriages. My favorite law from this set illustrates the general theme of the entire code. If a woman injures the testicle of a man in a fight, her finger will be cut off. But if the surviving testicle becomes infected or was injured in a subsequent fight, she would be blinded. Here are some others. If the man kisses the married woman, his lower lip would be cut off. If the man has sex with a married woman on the highway, I don't know if they were doing it on the back of an ox or what, knowing that she was married, then the woman's husband would dictate the punishment. If the man didn't know that she was married, the wife would be prosecuted by her husband as she likes. If a man walked in on his wife and her lover, he could kill them both. But if he cuts off the wife's nose, a very strange punishment, I guess they would mark you. Having no nose would mark you as being a cheater, and I get how that would work, but I just find it so unlikely. But anyway, if he cut off his wife's nose, he would also have to cut off the man's genitals as well as disfigure the man's face. A man having sex with his brother in arms, a gay lover, would result in both parties having their genitals cut off. Married women and unmarried daughters were to wear veils in the streets. I didn't know this. Prostitutes, which were legal at the time, did not wear veils. So this law made it easy essentially to tell who the hookers were. If one of the hookers was caught wearing a veil, masquerading as a married woman, she would be forced to remove it and pay a fine. Unlike the other laws, the Assyrians had a zero-tolerance policy for magic, with those accused being put to death. Here's a strange one. Causing a miscarriage in a woman resulted in a fine, but if you caused a miscarriage in a harlot, you would be physically beaten and would have to make restitution to her for the rest of her life. You tell me which one sounds worse. Under these laws, abortion was also illegal. If a woman willingly dropped that which is in her, she was to be crucified and not buried. The laws end saying that a man is free to pull his wife's hair, pull her ear, bruise her ear, or pierce her ear, which is very ear-centric. Again, the Assyrians seem to like noses and ears and those sorts of things. It's very foreign to me. As funny as those laws were, we do know that they had actual laws. Letters from the Middle Assyrian period made clear that they were concerned with other things. Take, for example, the following letter from Nasam-Ashur to Ubru. I am neither in debt nor am I a liar. In spite of that, you took from me a slave woman and a 10-year-old she-donkey. Take your witnesses and everything that speaks to your defense and come declare your trial. 7. What follows? This law code was devised towards the end of the Bronze Age world. It was not long after that world entirely collapsed. I say entirely, but the Assyrians weathered the collapse quite well and would survive for approximately 400 more years until they were taken over by the Neo-Babylonian Empire and then the Persian Empire. Chronologically, the next set of laws to emerge from late Bronze Age Mesopotamia are the laws of Moses and the Torah. Those laws, unlike the conditional if-then laws examined so far, contain moral prohibitions that many of you are familiar with. Thou shalt not blank. Thou shalt blank. Blah blah blah. The logic and history behind them is so different and so far-reaching in their consequences that they deserve their own coverage and will be the subject of a different video. So for now, thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like it, please subscribe, help me out a little bit, and be sure to tune in again to learn more about the laws of history.